Oh, here we go. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Iowa Ideas. Thanks for being here today. I am Vanessa Miller. I'm a reporter with the Gazette. I cover higher education primarily and some healthcare. So I'll be moderating this session. This is our 9th year of Iowa Ideas. We've been doing this for almost a decade, and it's a 2-day event. So we're doing sessions all day today and tomorrow. And I just want to start by thanking our primary sponsor, which is ITC Midwest. So again, the session that we are talking about today is about funding and federal funding, federal research, and yeah, just looking at how the government changes have impacted what our university academics are facing and doing right now. So I just wanted to start by having our panelists introduce themselves and talk just a little bit about what their involvement with this topic is. Yeah, do you want to start, Brian?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Brian Eckdale. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. And I can give a little background of kind of my personal experience, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Jones, who can talk about more broadly the experience. So one of my hats that I wear here is I direct a research group that studies the relationship between social media platforms, their personalization algorithms, and how that relates to society and societal changes. There are 16 of us in the group, faculty and graduate students. There's 6 different universities involved, and this involves folks from computer science and then my fields of communication and media. So we have received 2 large grants from what is called the Minerva Research Initiative, which is a social science program through the Department of Defense. This program was created in 2008 by then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates under the George W. Bush administration. The rationale for this program was that they were looking to try to learn lessons from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And part of the lessons were that wars aren't just won by strength. They're, that it's important to understand social, cultural, political context. And so Gates developed this program to help fund social science theory that could help basically inform the types of decisions and activities the Department of Defense is involved in. During the first Trump administration, there were threats that this program was going to get canceled. And then, Congress has always supported it, and it continued to get funded. We have 2 large grants from this in the past, and one of them had been completed, but we were halfway through the second in spring 25 when we received notice that our grant was going to be canceled effective immediately. Just briefly, the 2 projects we had, the first one, which we completed, was on the relationship between algorithmic personalization and radicalization online. The second project that we were in the process of working on was about foreign influence campaigns, looking particularly at campaigns that originate from Russia and China, and then trying to look at an international perspective. So how those campaigns are enacted in different contexts, from Ukraine to Kenya to the US. And so I've come to this discussion from the side of someone who's lost funding. So I can provide a personal experience from that. But I want to send it over to Dr. Jones, who can talk about her experience with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who can speak more broadly about what's happening in the field.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, folks. I'm Dr. Jen Jones. I'm the program director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are a national nonprofit founded over 50 years ago by scientists at MIT, who at that time were afraid of nuclear war and nuclear development. And since then, we have grown. We are a member supported organization. We do not take any federal dollars. We do not take any government dollars. We're entirely philanthropic, supported through members and foundations, of which we have over 500,000. So I work on the intersection of science and democracy, but at UCS, we have programs that work on climate change, energy, transportation, food, and more. And so broadly speaking, we're a science advocacy organization. We really believe that federal science in this case should be independent, free of politics. And we know that, every day, our mission is to make sure all of us have a safe and healthy world to wake up to every day. And we understand the role that science plays, including research and innovation that, powers our daily lives, from technology to the food you eat to the health and medications, etc. So I'll be glad to say more about the kind of research that we do, the kind of advocacy that we do, and also pushing lawmakers and the courts to be accountable to make sure that that science remains there for all of us people in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you guys both. So just kind of to start, I'm wondering if you, Jen, or Brian, either of you could just talk a little bit about, just broadly speaking, the federal funding changes that we've seen this year. I guess not just with funding, but if there are rule changes or restrictions, any sort of federal research related changes coming out of the government since the administrative change.
Yeah, maybe let me take that one. And, so the Union of Concerned Scientists, we have tracked what we call attacks on science for nearly 2 decades. And this is where we're tracking when we see political interference, whether it's a politician or political appointee telling somebody, you can't do that research, you can't say that, we're not permitting you to go to a conference, etc. And what we have seen this year is just an enormous increase in those attacks. We've tracked nearly 500 attacks just in the first 9 months of this new administration. And that includes, of course, the canceling of billions of dollars of research. And that is research that goes from the federal government. And some of it is research funds within those federal agencies. But a lot of that is monies that would flow to the state of Iowa, to Bryan's University, maybe to your public hospitals, other places. And historically, while it's understood that, elections have consequences, and your new administration absolutely does have the right and expectation to broadly shape future science and future research, historically that has been, they do that broadly. And what we're seeing this time is the word unprecedented is used a lot, but it's really true. And we have seen the cancellation of billions of dollars, thousands of grants. And these are grants that are being canceled originally by DOJ and in the recent weeks and months by other actors in the administration. And it's being done really haphazard and chaotically. So while historically maybe you would wind down a grant-funded program, and the selection of those grants, the changes to those grants would be done with the input of independent experts, right? Taking the politicians out of it. You have these independent advisory boards, they're basically tasked, hey, the politicians this year, the agencies have decided they want to fund water research and, let's say farm runoff research around an area. And then they would convene a panel of experts who would get more into the weeds around, okay, well, what kinds of grants specifically, what are the issues, what are the outcomes, what's the science that is needed to help improve the state of water in Iowa, for example. And all of that has been totally upended, where all those independent advisory boards and groups that would historically help determine these grants, determine the research, make the actual selection of awards. Like when Brian got his federal grant, he would have applied for it. His proposal would have been screened by a panel of experts. They would have selected them based on, does it achieve our outcomes for this year, the merits, the likelihood of success, etc. And so the vast majority of those independent advisory bodies have been fired, and fired en masse, not just like rolling over a handful. Mm-hmm. And in the absence of those advisors, now what you see really for the first time in history are political appointees, people that have been appointed by the elected administration to be overseeing these grants. And now they're making these changes to research and funding purely based on their politics. And I would also say that the vast majority of these folks have no actual grounding or expertise in these issues of which they are changing. So cut to where we are today. And if you want, I can jump to share a screen with you that I pulled up some impacts in Iowa. So this is not our original research, and bear with me. It will take just a moment. I believe I've got several pages. Let's go to this one first. Before I logged on, I went and can you see my screen?
Not yet, but yep, here it comes.
All right, let's give it a moment. So this is actually a website. It's a commercial site historically meant to help people find grants. So if you were a university or a nonprofit and you were looking for somebody to help sponsor your work, you could go on here and look around. But what this site has done is also track the amounts of grants and things that have been funded or, canceled or revoked. And so we can see here in this database, I believe it might not have been updated since August. So this is not like a live site, but we can see over 15,000 grants, $112 billion. So I scroll down here to where you can see search by funding impact. I just put in the state of Iowa. And, what do we see here? Well, over $241 million have already been impacted, revoked, lost. It's really hard to know. Again, some of this may have changed in the interim. But we go down here and we can see the diversity of folks impacted in the state as well. We've got Soybean Association. We've got the Iowa State Department. You've got tribal organizations, university organizations, etc. And so this is, I have not added this up, but this is, let's see, there it is, $241 million. And this is, I'm going to stop sharing and come back. I want folks to take note. If you want any kind of data like this, you can go to grantexec.com. I can put that in there.
Yeah, that's what I was going to wonder. Grantexec.com is the website. Okay, that people can go to. But yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And I'm so thankful that someone's out there doing that work. You had kind of mentioned this, or we're getting to it maybe, but are these cuts across the board, or were there specific topics or areas that were cut harder or more, or were affected more than others?
Certainly, there have been some areas that have been affected more than others, and that continues to change. News coming out last night with a whole new round of cancellations and impacts that are going to hit the humanities and arts. Of course, in the early days of this administration, back in January, February, we saw DOJ cutting anything that had even just the words diversity or equity in it. But this is, also across the board. Cancer research has been funded and halted. USDA research has been funded and halted. And so, by dollar amount, the biggest group that is being impacted because it had the biggest amount of funding is indeed your health and human services, because the National Institutes of Health proudly have been the global leader in medical and health research for decades. That is the science, that is the federal science that they do, and the grants that they, a grant basically is just going out to university against somebody like Brian saying, hey, we're the federal government, we're the NIH, we need to know more about this issue with cancer. We need to know more about this air quality issue. Please go and help us figure this out and then report back to us. And so, the grant-sponsored research, of course, it creates jobs in communities. Think about your universities. So much of this money, too, Vanessa, is these grants when they go to professors, when they go to universities. For many of our students, that is also the first place that they will get an opportunity to do research in the sciences, to get hired on as a part-time student, lab or field technician. And so these grants are stopping the research, but they're also stopping that pipeline to develop those scientists that we need in the future. And this is, well, I mentioned health. These are also, impacting students in technology. Again, arts and sciences, economics. It's across the board, but undoubtedly the NIH just being big is the biggest hit.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I did forget to mention this at the start of our conversation, but for anybody who's watching and listening in right now, if you have questions, you could put that into the chat, the Zoom chat, or the Q&A box from where you're watching, and those will come to me. I feel like doing that in real time as they come to you sometimes works best so that we can shoot them to our panelists as we're talking about the topic you have a question about. So anyway, feel free to do that as you have questions. One thing I wanted to ask Brian, because I know your topic came, and you mentioned this earlier, but the Minerva Research Institute, as Dr. Jones has said, that was kind of a social science type of program. Can you talk a little bit more about what that was and what happened to it since January?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Vanessa. And thanks for all that context, Jen. So the Minerva Research Initiative, it's been around for more than 15 years. And, I've been funded through that since 2020. And so I've been able to go to a number of program reviews where various people who are funded come together and present. And there's a lot of really valuable research that was funded through this. And, it's a variety. So every year how it works is they put on a new call for funding that has particular priority areas that have been determined based by internal conversations, and say, these are areas that would benefit the Department of Defense broadly or specific elements of it. So for example, my particular funding was from a section that was run by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. So they put out these priorities, and then people apply for the priorities, and then they select from that group, and then those are the folks that get funded. But I'm thinking about some of the individual projects that were funded, and in addition to our work, there were other people who were doing work on kind of the role of the media and social media, and what happens, what are the drivers of radicalization, within the U.S., what drives folks to become radicalized within the U.S. There were other folks. There was a political science professor who was doing historical research on Cambodia and looking at what has been the legacy of undetonated bombs or like landmines that the U.S. left in Cambodia after the Vietnam War, and how that has sowed kind of distrust and cynicism in the U.S. government. And, that gets us thinking about how we might want to, repair those relationships, and also what are the activities we're doing now and what are the long-term consequences of those. There's also research that was looking at things. There was a lot of research related to in the military, they're increasingly incorporating these team-based decision-making that have artificial agents, and by that it could be artificial intelligence, it could be robots, it could be simulated things. And so there was a lot of research on like, how do you develop trust in team-based work in which one member of the team is an artificial agent or one member of the team is a robot? So there's a real range of research that was taking place through Minerva. And you asked earlier if there were specific topics. So one of the things that happened in when Trump became president, one of his first executive orders were to indicate that the federal government had no interest in dedicated funding to, and named 3 topics: climate change, DEI, and then what the administration calls gender ideology, which is a focus on trans folks and their lives. And so there was an initial round with Minerva where I'm not sure how they determined or what was the mechanism they determined, but they did cut a certain number of programs because they thought that those did not align with the priorities indicated in that executive order. It was only a matter of weeks when they decided they were just going to get rid of the whole program broadly. So I do want to note that my particular study was not singled out and targeted as not aligned with priorities of the administration. It was the Secretary of Defense's decision to just cut the program entirely. That said, I do have colleagues in my field, not at the University of Iowa, but at other places, who were doing large research funded through things like the NSF or maybe even the NEH, that were doing work on misinformation, right? Misinformation spreading on social media. And most, if not all of that work I should say most, because some of it is attached in different ways, most of that work has been terminated as well. And so there's been a decision in the administration to not fund mis and disinformation research, which, I think is a huge societal issue that we need to be wrestling with right now. And the funding agency, the funding opportunities coming from the federal government allow people to tackle big questions. The last thing I'll say about this, so we had a program officer, someone who worked in the Department of Defense, who was kind of our contact and our liaison, and I had a call with her one time and basically asked, like, what are the projects you want to fund? And she said, I want to fund projects where people are taking big swings to tackle difficult questions plaguing the United States right now. And that's the type of work that can't happen anymore. Taking these big swings, which do advance science, do advance our understanding of what is happening in the world around us. And that's something that, there's certainly, I can do research without this large funding, but it's a different type of research. And, it's a different type of impact and a different type of contribution. And when we lose these opportunities, there is a loss to society from that.
Yeah, right. And when you first, because I know, so the research you were doing out of the Minerva Institute or initiative, sorry, it was like there were two phases of it, right? And so, like, the first phase, that was in 2020 when obviously disinformation was a national priority. Can you talk a little bit about what you did in that first phase and how it differed from the second phase that you were working on?
Sure, yeah. And so, these two phases were kind of entirely separate projects as far as their proposals. But that first project was trying to understand, there's a lot of conversations about radicalization and radicalization online, and we wanted to look at that scientifically. And so we did there's a few things we do, and we collaborate with our computer science colleagues as well. So there was a lot of computational work that was happening from our computer scientists that were looking at, how do communities on platforms like Reddit become toxic, right? What is the pathway to radicalization for those communities? And then we did a bunch of human subjects research as well. So we worked with the research firm. We did what's called a longitudinal survey. So we surveyed the same people a year apart. During that time frame, we were able to collect, they opted into this program, that we were able to collect their data about what they did online during the course of that year, so that we could try to make sense of changing views and behaviors and how that aligns with specific actions. And then we followed up with interviews with a subset of those folks so we could kind of dive in deeper. And so that was what the first study was about. And we were able to complete the funding cycle, before the termination. The second study, which was funded, I think started in 2023, so we were about 18 months into it. This was looking still at social media, still looking at problematic content, but we were particularly interested in influence campaigns that were trying to shape public opinion from foreign governments. And we certainly had a lot of evidence of Russia and China both engaging in these behaviors. And we were trying to look at this from a global perspective. So we were working with audiences in the US, but we also were doing research on audiences in Kenya, where both Russia and China are playing an increasing role in trying to influence and build diplomatic relationships. And then we were also looking at the Ukraine, where Russia is engaged in a hot war, and China also has an interest as well. And so this was intended to be a 3-phase study. The second one, and we were essentially in the final steps of phase 1, which was doing initial focus groups that we were using to inform a large-scale experiment that was going to be deployed in all 3 countries. And then we were going to follow up with interviews as well. So, luckily we were able to complete the focus groups, but we had spent about a year designing an experiment that we, are no longer able to do. And so, the focus groups were supposed to inform these later parts of data collection that now will not happen unless we're able to find another way to pursue that.
Is it work that you think you can shelve for like a few years and pick back up if something changes at the national level, or does it need to happen quickly? Like, is there a time peg to it?
I mean, I guess what I would say is anytime there's kind of a delay between phases, you have to kind of rethink and recalibrate. So, maybe the information that we gathered in the focus groups becomes a little bit more dated. I don't see any indication that foreign influence on social media, these types of campaigns are going away. And, we see lots of evidence that it's heating up and becoming more clandestine. And so I do think that this work could still be relevant in the future. Say, there's a change in the leadership at the federal level and there's a decision to change research priorities and do that. But it's hard for me to kind of envision that happening right now. And so I think as a group, as we're working through some of the data we have, and we're trying to be forward thinking as well, it's trying to think, okay, what are other avenues in which we can salvage this research? I'll be honest, like we're not quite sure what that looks like right now.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so one question I had for both of you, I mean, Brian, maybe for you from a personal perspective, and then Jen, just based on what you've heard, do you think these changes were surprising to researchers, or, were folks preparing for something like this, or yeah, what was the reaction, do you think?
Well, I can speak from my experience, yes and no. I mean, I think we could certainly see by the time our program was cut, we had read reports about other funding cuts. We knew about DOGE working their way into different funding agencies, and we would hear about other research projects being cut around. And certainly I saw some earlier projects being cut through Minerva. But, the way that it was executed was so outside of the norm. I had conversations with the grant support office here, and I said, look, what might this mean for us? How can we prepare and anticipate? And, from their understanding, they had never experienced anything like this. And so they said, well, you're in year 2 of your funding, and the government has basically released the funds to the university for that year 2. And so we were all on the belief that even if our program were to be cut, we would have funding through September, which is kind of the start of our grant cycle. And so I've been kind of operating on that assumption that we were trying to hurry as best as we can, but that was kind of the countdown clock, that if we were going to get cut, it was basically we had the funds for the year. And instead what happened, there was a day, Wednesday in March, I received an email from my program officer around 8:30 that said, you're going to get an email today that terminates the grant. And by 10 o'clock, I had the official termination notice, but there was almost no information in there. And so immediately I'm in conversations with the grant support office, like, what does this mean? It says effective today. What does that mean for our current data collection operations, that they've conducted the work, but we have not paid the invoices yet? What does this mean for the 4 graduate students we had who are funded on this, who are halfway through the semester? Are we able to pay for their tuition, for their salary for the rest of the semester? Because they need to be students, right? And we've made those promises to them. There was, things that some of these students had turned down opportunities for other summer internships or funding opportunities to work on this project. And now we didn't know. And it took several weeks to navigate that. And, I do want to be, certainly gracious to the leadership at the University of Iowa, who, especially in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who were very, helpful and said, we're going to work to try to find clarity. We're going to make sure that we, fill any gaps that you have. But, there's the disappointment of not being able to do the research. But I have to go and tell my RA, I don't know what this means for your funding. We're going to find a way to give you money, but I'm sure he was sweating over, does this mean I have to drop out of this semester? The lack of communication was really startling. And so I would say, there was some writing on the wall, some indications that this might be coming, but the manner in which it was enacted was so disorienting that it, took months to sort out. And that's months that me as a researcher is not doing research. This is months in which I, as a researcher, am taking care of administrative logistics to remedy something that was poorly rolled out.
Right. I mean, that speaks to what you were saying earlier, Dr. Jones, just about kind of the chaotic nature of it, that it seemed like there were big cuts happening, but there were no details, right? Like about what it actually meant and what researchers should do functionally
Yeah.
with the information.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian did an excellent job of showing what it looks like for people, at their universities. I would back up a little bit or just kind of bring us to a broader level in that, some of this was expected because it really is taken right out of Project 2025, right?
Mhm.
So that's the Heritage Foundation's blueprint, essentially, that we are seeing put into play that is shaping all of these decisions. And so, and that includes decisions that are impacting staffing at federal agencies, the grant making, how the dollars are being spent, and so much more. But I would just back out and say, aside from the political nature of so many of these haphazards and highly politicized decisions, what's really just, truly upsetting and frustrating is that the American system of research and development has been recognized as the leader, the global leader for what everybody aspires for. And we understand, depending on which statistic that you use, it's an amazing economic multiplier. So, for every dollar that we invest in research in this country, it can produce up to $2.50 of outcome. And so, again, if I think about, say, farming in Iowa, how much of that is the beneficiary of technology and research that has been decades in the making, from mechanization and the actual computers used on farm machines. When we think about certainly weather prediction and satellites, some of those weather satellites that have already been pulled down at NOAA. Trump made a decision and pulled them down basically within a few days, and that will impact climate forecasting. When you think about all the money, indeed, that's put into health research and medical research, that we are set to lose, our amazing scientific capacity and all that it brings to our economy and our communities, I think is that part has been unexpected, that this administration would go this far. I think it's also important to recognize, again, the chaotic nature, of the grants, essentially many of them being cut by, a DOGE employee, probably using some keyword search, huge chunks just being cut out. And not taking the time to wind research down. That is, again, happening in some of the health-related research. And, I think what Brian also had mentioned a little while ago, the role that disinformation has played. And I think what we're seeing now, what really also scares me, is the role of, disinformation that we are seeing at the top of these scientific agencies, and how they are going to shape scientific research and innovation into the future. And so in this case, I'm thinking about, indeed, Secretary Kennedy leading the HHS, and, all the cuts they made to vaccine research, all the firing en masse of vaccine experts. And then what we're seeing that replaced with are hand-picked political appointees, many of them, not scientific experts. And frankly, a number of them are discredited and they're doctors who have lost their medical license. And these are now the folks that are going to shape this research into vaccines. And why this matters, putting the actual issue of vaccines aside, is that this now becomes a really dangerous precedent for political appointees to go on and impact huge swaths of funding and public health issues based on their own fringe beliefs, because this vaccine research is it's so discredited for decades. And I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't know a lot about Iowa, so I apologize to residents to not being an Iowa expert. I know some amount about food policy. I've taught global food policy as a professor at Virginia Tech for many, 15 years now. And, you know, when I think about what I would be worrying about if I was, you know, a farmer in Iowa, if I'm a conventional farmer and I'm probably using genetically modified seeds and I'm, you know, dependent on these things, I would be worried that, you know, that this administration has torn down the checks and balances that make sure that independent science can happen. And so it could be, you know, into the future, and this is just speculation on my part, I don't have any evidence to back this up, but the same way we've seen a group within HHS go after vaccines and is now, you know, that has now rippled out across the country. In my home state of Florida, I cannot even get a COVID vaccine if I wanted to because there's no access. Now imagine that the administration turned their eyes towards genetically modified organisms and seeds and all the farm implements and inputs that are required to produce the food that we all depend on and we're thankful that Iowans produce. And so those checks and balances have been lost. And so conceivably, again, I don't have specific information about this, but you could see that entire industry disrupted overnight. And of course, we already know it's been disrupted by the tariffs and impacts to USAID exports, etc. But those are I can't overestimate or sorry emphasize the level of systems change that has been made here. And it's always been understood that the role is for scientists to produce the best available evidence. We count on folks like Brian and others. They go off and produce the science, they produce evidence, but then it's understood that that evidence gets turned over to policymakers and they are free to use it as needed. But now what's happening is that the science is no longer independent and you have political appointees impacting every stage and level. And it is increasingly being done by state-sanctioned disinformation. And because it's so chaotic and unpredictable, who's next?
Right.
You know, what large part of our American economy is next because a political appointee has decided they no longer like or support that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think your example of the potential impact on GMOs is really an interesting one. Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to just note too, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but just your concern about disinformation being sort of the thing that Brian was researching on a broader scale, you know, that was cut off is obviously relevant. And I also just wanted to note that, like, while this is not research related, but the University of Iowa's International Writing Program, you know, similarly lost its federal funding, its grant that had kept it going for years, and that was more about international goodwill and ambassadorship, you know, in addition to doing that. But obviously, that's a loss for the country as well. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about were when we're looking not just at federal funding cuts, but some of the rule changes or restrictions. Some of them were blocked by courts, right? So can one of you talk about what indirect sort of research expenses are and what that 15% cap, you know, how NIH, I think, tried to impose that, the Department of Defense tried to impose that, and what happened there with the courts and what that would have meant, I guess, if it were allowed to go through.
Sure, I can jump in. So let's say I get a federal grant for $100,000, like the federal government writes a check for $100,000 for me to do research. That money is split into kind of two categories, what are called direct funds and what are called indirect funds. And direct funds go to fund research. Maybe it's for data collection, maybe it's for a portion of someone's time, maybe it's for research assistant's salary. There's all sorts of things that count in kind of direct research. A portion of those funds go to what's called indirect research, and that goes to the institution to support all of the additional things that make grant-funded research possible or large-scale research possible. So I have expertise. I'm a PhD in journalism, mass communication. I have expertise in media. I do not have expertise in how to do payroll. I do not have expertise in how to put together a budget. I do not have expertise in how to make sure that my submission that I'm following all the kind of the regulatory compliance. And so institutions like the University of Iowa have a number of administrative staff who handle those responsibilities. And so those are the people that we rely on really heavily to make sure that our research can work. And at the same time, so that we don't have to spend as much time focused on the logistics, we can focus on the ideas and the research. So how that works in the past has been is institutions negotiate with the government for what that percentage is going to be. And it's not uncommon for a research intensive university like the University of Iowa to have indirect costs around, say, 50%. Doesn't mean if that $100,000, they get half of it. It means that every time, I spend $100 on a research expense, they take an additional kind of $50 on top of that. It's kind of like a tax to help me do that work. And so, a 50% indirect fund means that it's kind of split into the university takes a third of that. We take 2/3 of that to do our research. In the past, universities have negotiated that, and people have different rates depending on the different institutions you're a part of. What was proposed in these changes is that these federal agencies had just decided, no, everybody's paying the same rate and it's going to be 15%. Now that's a pretty massive cut to institutions like the University of Iowa. It doesn't mean that I would get less money as a researcher to do the research, but it would mean that all of the additional administrative resources that I rely on to secure funding, to administer funding, to do all that, that they would take a pretty substantial cut. And institutions like the University of Iowa rely on that external funding to keep the infrastructure running. And so were this to go into place, from my personal experience, when I first thought, hey, I've got some big ideas and it'd be great if I could find some funding to do this, I talked to someone on at the university and said, how does this work? I don't know how this works, to be honest. And he explained to me the process. He helped me figure out how to find funding resources. He identified the Minerva Research Initiative, which I'd never heard of before, told me about it. He worked with me in making sure that my proposal met the requirements. He developed a budget for me and knew how much it cost to do X, Y, and Z. I would not get this grant without the work that he did. And then on the back end, once I received the funding, I would not be able to continue to do my job if I spent all my time working about figuring out payroll decisions and all that. Like, researchers rely on that administrative work. And so when the federal government says we're going to change that, it has a pretty significant impact. And again, part of this is, different administrations have different priorities, but part of it is that's the haphazard nature, and it's changing agreements that were already made, right? This was an agreement that was already made for our particular grant, that there were X for direct funds and Y for indirect funds. And then to come and say, actually, we're not going to pay that amount of indirect funds. We don't want to do that anymore. That's a pretty substantial change that an institution like the University of Iowa was not prepared for. There are certainly funding opportunities. So for example, in my field, Facebook will do some funding opportunities for doing research on social media. And they will write specifically in the call that there are no indirect funds. Like, that's just something they don't do. And that's something that private organizations can choose to do. And so when the institution helps you apply for that, they at least know and they can account for that. But when there's a certain amount of money that was already kind of accounted for as indirect funds on a 5-year grant, and that changes the deal, right? Imagine hiring a contractor to work on your house, and halfway through that it says, actually, I'm going to pay you 20% less from now on, right? That doesn't seem like a fair negotiation, and I feel like that's what's happening with these changing the indirect rules midway through.
Right. And I know the courts did block those efforts to do the 15% cap, but I'm just wondering, I don't actually know, are there appeals happening, or is it still a threat, that institutions are watching?
Maybe Jen knows more than I. I will say this is the type of thing that, like, this is not my expertise. And so as much as I follow it, like, it's hard for me to understand it. And so I don't know the legal mechanisms of when these things get fought out in court, because I don't have expertise in law. And so that's why I rely on the administrative support from my institution to monitor these things and translate it to me.
Yeah.
But Yeah, Jen, I don't know if you know any more about kind of like the current status.
I do know the exact current status of some of those cases, but I think it's another powerful reminder that uh, so many of these actions are being tested as illegal, from all the mass firings to the stoppage of grants to the dismissals to reorganizing agencies, etc. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're involved in multiple pieces of litigation, including the administration took down large federal data sets that we use for our research. They removed web pages with information that is publicly funded data science information that all of us have access to. And so, again, when we talk about were the impacts expected that we're seeing now, I don't think it was expected to see just the sheer amount of illegal actions and activities. And so it will be months, years, while some of these things continue to work their way through the courts. Let me just say that, again, what's really frustrating and disappointing is I don't know if the administration that's making these choices, I don't know if they don't understand the importance of universities and research, or they don't appreciate them. Again, every one of these dollars that goes to a university to support a researcher like Brian is an amazing investment in that community and in your state. To have a university in your hometown and your home state is to be the envy of so many others. And maybe also to have a hospital that also does research. And that it is a place where we create this amazing research. Of course, it creates a lot of local jobs, and it becomes a pipeline for our young people and for education. And increasingly in the world we live in today, it creates the networks and relationships that we have across the country. And as research is increasingly global, the connections we have to others around the world. And so this sort of research and innovation is really how our communities, increasingly stay and become relevant in the 21st century. And so by making these, essentially political decisions that just, use some abstract number of 15%, is to not fully appreciate that these are that grants and federal dollars are investments in our community. Let me pull up very quickly a map. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but a map for Iowa.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I'm going to, this is produced by another organization. Let's give it a second. We know it takes a moment to pull up. Let me know when you see it. I see an empty screen. It doesn't show the map. It shows the towns.
Yeah, I can see that it's indicating there's the United States under there somewhere.
Give me just a moment. I'm going to do a refresh, and we'll see if that refreshes the map. I'm refreshing the page.
Okay.
Let me okay. So this is the Center for American Progress. I don't know the exact data, and my plan here is not to go into a deep dive, but just so folks know that there are resources like this, you can go to americanprogress.org. And I don't know, and I'm hesitant to scroll around too much for the time lag. But folks can go in and you can click on your state here, and we can see. Well, it's not bringing up the data points here, but we can see 21, almost $22 million in impacted grants. This should, well, it is not bringing up the data points. I have a feeling it is probably a time lag on my part, but make note of this. I can share, let me try one other website. I'm going to stop sharing that screen if you will bear with me. I'm now going to move to another data set produced so that your folks there can get information relative to their
Yeah. I was just, because I know we're focused obviously today on the University of Iowa with Brian here, but was looking up some things. I think Iowa State recently reported that they had 22 terminated grants. So it's obviously affecting, and there are many other institutions that had federal, funding across the state and across the region too.
All right, everything is very slow, but again, make note of this website, scienceimpacts.org. This
Okay.
is specific to federal health research cuts. Again, I'm not going to scroll around too much, but folks can go and you can look at, you can zoom in and go and look at the specific cuts that have been lost. This is where I've let the cursor land is here in Polk County. And where this is really powerful numbers is understanding that the current loss might be 190,000 and less than 10 jobs. The longer term impact and predicted future losses could be as much as almost 7 million in 28 jobs. So, this is not, you have to take Brian's story and just multiply it by certainly hundreds in Iowa and likely thousands and thousands across the across the country. And what makes all of this, let me just stop sharing that screen. What makes this challenging as well is that, we won't know and appreciate the full impacts of this probably for years to come. And so it's really important and hard to get the public to appreciate just how serious this is. Oftentimes when we see these large systemic changes in staffing and research and funding, we should expect it could take 1, 2, 3 political cycles for all of this to shake out, right? And so by the time we fully appreciate that these lost revenues, this lost research grants, the lost staffing, your water quality in Iowa, which I understand, is an important issue for folks, could be so dire that at some point it's almost not too late, but becomes much more difficult to clean up, much more challenging. And the health impacts that people and the environment are already impacting will have impacted. Everything just gets harder. And we won't know that right away because you turn the faucet off right away, but it will take time and years for those impacts to be known. And, for the student money to dry up and for that next generation of students, even if we start making better decisions that support science and innovation immediately, sadly, some of these horrible impacts are already baked into the system for years to come.
Yeah, that was definitely like one of my questions was looking ahead. Even if there is an administrative change, what kind of unwinding some of this could look like. So if you have any more to say on that, that would be great. We have a few minutes left here, and I did want to ask about the shutdown, the government shutdown, and if that could potentially have any impact on federal research, federally funded research or programs happening on the campuses across the country?
Yes, for sure. So we're in day 2 of a federal shutdown, and that basically means that, all non-essential services have been closed and shuttered. Of course, we're hearing out of the White House, they may use this as an opportunity to further fire more people, close more agencies. So it's really hard to know in this administration where every new day is truly unprecedented in terms of how they're making decisions, often illegal. Then we have to wait for the courts to sort it out. But, you should expect to see that, even just like Brian said, the distribution of funds to stop, because the people who probably actually click the keyboards that disperse the funds may have been sent home. And so all that payroll activity, all the peer review of literature, all the systems that take place have halted. There may, and certainly that can include many of the federally funded research labs that we have around the country as well. There may be some exceptions made for some research where people have certain samples, live animals and things that continue to need care. But again, the people doing the work will have been told to go home. And Vanessa, I don't know where we're at on time, but I want to just give a quick shout out to your viewers and what they can be thinking about and doing, because this is advice, I would have given before the shutdown, but now with the shutdown is even more important. The people here that have the ability to fund science, to fund the research for your communities, to have clean air and clean water for your universities, to have the money to build that next generation of students to do that work, is Congress. And call it's an old adage, but it's true. Call your congressperson. Call them, let them know that you support science, that you support research. Share your own story. If you have lost your job, if you have lost money, share that. Ask them to make sure that they stick up for Congress to still have the power of the purse. And that's one of the things, too, we've seen that's unprecedented here, is that the executive branch, i.e. the president and the White House, are making decisions and money decisions and funding decisions that typically would have been made by Congress and would have been made by committees and experts that Congress calls on to help advise them. And right now, none of that is happening with the shutdown. And even before the shutdown, you have a few political appointees who are making essentially the determination of what science and research in this country will look like for the next few decades.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I guess we only have a few minutes here. My last question for you, maybe, Brian, is just like, do you think researchers are going to be sort of adapting, like you said, like you mentioned Facebook, or like just looking for other ways to do the research? Or is that, I can't see science and research stopping, despite some of the roadblocks being thrown up. So how are researchers finding sort of innovative ways to keep going?
Yeah, I think people will be resilient, and they're going to try to figure out ways to fund the work that they think is important and vital research. I think what is going to happen, there are some private foundations that fund research, usually not at the same level. I think that those venues are just going to get exponentially larger applications than they did before, because people who no longer see the federal government funding their research are going to turn to these outlets. I think what's happening too is the budgets are getting cut in funding agencies like the NIH, NEH, NSF. And so if the acceptance rate might go down from, say, 10% to 5%. And so things are going to be even more competitive at current funding agencies, just because there's going to be less money to be given out. And so it's hard for me to see a way in which we have the same amount of research before than we did after. People are going to pivot. There's going to be different types of things that people are going to study, because they feel that the work that they're doing is not going to get funded. And I think as a result of that, there's going to be important ideas that aren't explored. And I do think there's just going to be less of it. And it's hard to fully know what the downstream consequences of that are. And I think Jen has pointed out rightly that, like, maybe we're not seeing it today. Maybe we're not going to see it for a few years, but this is going to have a pretty significant impact on higher education in the United States. It's going to change who gets access to it, what type of work is being done, and where do the best and brightest want to go. And for a long time, the best and brightest in academia want to work at research institutions in the United States. And it's hard to say that that will be the case in the years to come, because they may go to other places that are going to be more welcoming environments, are going to fund the type of research that they want to do. And I think that that's going to have a significant impact on the nation's research. And certainly, you're going to see these impacts in the research being done in the state of Iowa as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of like the idea of brain drain, but for researchers.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time, but I just want to thank you both for being here and talking this through with everybody today. It's been really, really informational and informative. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor again, ITC Midwest, and let everybody know, obviously, that Iowa Ideas is continuing. I think that the next education track session that's happening at 11:45 here is just talking about the teacher shortage, so more from the K through 12 perspective. And then the next one really focused on higher education will be this afternoon at 1:55, and that's on academic freedoms. So talking about the intense scrutiny on speech, but also like some of this Center for Intellectual Freedom stuff happening at the University of Iowa, and sort of civic education and what's being taught, and sort of legislative roles. And so anyway, it should be a pretty interesting discussion, just given how much is happening across Iowa right now. So anyway, thank you guys all so much for tuning in, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks,
Thanks.
John.
Yep.